Imagine a young man in 1890 Japan, not in a city, not in a boardroom, but in a small wooden shed in the village of Yamaguchi, Shizuoka Prefecture. The air smells of raw cedar and machine oil. Outside, the rice fields stretch flat to the horizon, and the sound of hand-operated textile looms fills every home in the valley, like a kind of low, persistent heartbeat. This man, 22 years old, the son of a carpenter, educated just enough to understand what was broken, has been watching his mother and the women of the village weave by hand since he could walk. He has watched them work themselves half to death. 12 hours a day, bent over wooden frames, and he has decided, with a quiet certainty that borders on obsession, that there must be a better way. His name is Kiichiro Toyoda, and he has no idea, none, that the machine he is assembling in this shed will one day become the intellectual seed of the most reliable automobile company the world has ever produced. This is the story of Toyota, not the story of a corporation. This is the story of a dream that was handed from a father to a son, like a family heirloom that nobody could sell, a dream that survived 2 world wars, a near total collapse, a bankruptcy that should have ended everything, and an era of rebuilding from the rubble up. If you've ever started something from nothing, if you've ever refused to quit when every rational voice told you to, this story belongs to you. And if you're new here, this channel is built for people who want to understand history the way it actually happened. Not as a timeline of events, but as a sequence of human decisions made under impossible conditions. Subscribe, because we're just getting started. Kiichiro Toyoda's first wooden loom, patented in 1891, was a modest improvement on what existed. It wasn't revolutionary, not yet, but it worked better. It moved faster. It demanded less from the women who operated it, and it gave more back. That was the philosophy, even if no one called it a philosophy at the time. The idea was simple: study what is broken, understand why it is broken, and build something better. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for capital. Start with the materials you have and refine until the thing becomes what it needs to be. Over the next 2 decades, Kiichiro would iterate, patent after patent, loom after loom. Each version improved on the last in some specific, measurable way. Faster threading, reduced thread breakage, more even tension, less physical labor from the operator. He was not building products, he was building a method. A philosophy of improvement that had no finish line, only the next version of a better machine. In Japan, this impulse would eventually be named Kaizen, the idea that improvement is not an event, but a practice, continuous and permanent. Kiichiro didn't use that word, he just couldn't stop making things better. By 1906, he had produced a loom that was genuinely superior to anything on the Japanese market. But it was in 1924 that he built the machine that would finance everything that came after. The Type G automatic power loom. This was not an improvement, this was a transformation. The Type G could detect a broken thread and stop itself automatically before the defect could propagate through the fabric. In an industry where a single defect could ruin an entire roll of expensive silk, this was revolutionary. The machine was, in effect, thinking, or at least watching itself for failure and intervening before failure became catastrophe. Kiichiro called this principle jidoka, automation with a human touch. The machine would stop so a person could fix the problem. Quality was not something you inspected for at the end. Quality was built into the process itself. Platt Brothers of England, one of the largest textile machinery manufacturers in the world, recognized what they were looking at. In 1929, they paid £100,000, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time, for the rights to manufacture the Type G outside Japan. £100,000. That number mattered not because it made Kiichiro Toyoda wealthy, but because it handed his son a starting gun. Kiichiro Toyoda had been watching his father his whole life. He had inherited the precision, the obsession, the refusal to accept that something couldn't be made better. But he had also grown up in a changing world. Cars, Automobiles were beginning to appear on Japanese roads, imported from the United States at enormous cost. And Kiichiro, who was an engineer by training and a visionary by temperament, had become convinced that Japan needed to build its own, that the country's future, its industrial independence, depended on it. His father saw this. Before Sakichi Toyoda died in 1930, he told his son something that would frame the next 20 years of Kiichiro's life. He said, "I devoted my life to the loom. You should devote yours to the automobile." This is not a documented quote from a boardroom speech. This was a father passing a thread to a son, asking him to keep weaving. Kiichiro used the money from the Platt Brothers sale to begin his research. And here's the thing, he didn't just want to assemble cars. Japan was already importing American models and copying them piece by piece, the way a student traces letters to learn handwriting. Kiichiro wanted to do something harder. He wanted to understand the original, copy it exactly, and then, eventually, surpass it. Many industries copy to survive. Few use copying as a launchpad to transcend their models. Kiichiro intended to be in the second group, even if it took a generation. In 1933, Toyota, still spelled with a D, still a department inside Toyota Automatic Loom Works, began producing its first engine prototypes. The team was small, underfunded by any global standard, and working in a country that had no domestic automobile industry to draw from. They reverse-engineered Chevrolet engines. They sourced metal and studied American chassis designs. They failed, many times in many ways, and they went back to the workbench. By 1935, they had produced their first prototype passenger car, the Model A1. It was not sophisticated, it was not beautiful, but it ran. And the fact that it ran, in that factory, with those people and that budget, was itself an act of will that most observers at the time did not give enough credit. In 1937, Toyota Motor Company was formally established as a separate entity. Not a department, a company. With Kiichiro at its head, the company opened the Koromo plant in Aichi Prefecture, a manufacturing facility purpose-built for automobile production at scale. That same year, they sold roughly 1,500 vehicles. Small numbers, but the loom was in motion. Then the war came. Between 1937 and 1945, Toyota's production was redirected almost entirely toward military vehicles, trucks primarily, for the Imperial Japanese Army. The company didn't choose this path the way a business chooses a market. War is not a market, it is an imposition. Production of passenger cars effectively ceased. Resources were controlled by the government. Kiichiro, a man whose dream was to build reliable vehicles for ordinary Japanese families, spent the war years building trucks for a military campaign whose consequences would reduce his country to rubble. 1945, a ruined country. Factories damaged, materials scarce, purchasing power collapsed. And an Allied occupation that imposed restrictions on Japanese industrial output that were only gradually lifted in the years that followed. In 1947, Toyota produced its first post-war passenger car, the SA model, also known informally as the Toyopet. It sold just over 300 units. For a company that had once moved thousands of military vehicles, this was almost silence. Kiichiro pushed forward. He had to. Not pushing forward was not a philosophy that ran in this family. He expanded the model range. He hired aggressively. He borrowed, heavily, against a future that Japan's banks were not convinced would arrive. By 1949, the debt was critical. Toyota owed a sum equivalent to 8 times its capital. The banks, specifically Nagoya's banking consortium, held the company's fate in their hands. They did not simply refuse to lend more money. They imposed conditions. They required Toyota to restructure, to separate its sales division, and to reduce its workforce by over 1,600 employees. In a country where corporate loyalty was not just a value, but an identity, where workers had given years to this company and carried the culture of the factory floor in their bones, this was not an accounting adjustment. It was a human catastrophe. Kiichiro Toyoda resigned. The son who had inherited his father's dream, who had built an automobile company from a loom patent and a dying man's instructions, he resigned. Not because he had failed, not because the vision was wrong, but because he believed that the leader who allowed the conditions that led to the layoffs bore responsibility for those layoffs. He fell on his sword so that the company could survive. This moment, this single decision, is the emotional core of everything Toyota would later become. Not the technology, not the production systems, not the global expansion. The core is a man who walked away from everything he had built because he believed that loyalty ran in both directions. He died in 1952, 2 years after his resignation, before he could see what happened next. This is the grief the story carries. The son who kept the thread never got to see the tapestry completed. But here's the thing. The thread held. In 1950, the Korean War began, and what the Korean War meant for Toyota in the most immediate practical sense was that the United States military needed trucks. Trucks in quantity, trucks in a hurry, and Toyota, already restructured, already lean from the forced cuts of the banking crisis, was in a position to supply them. The contracts injected approximately 5 billion yen into Toyota's production over a 2-year period. For a company that had been within months of dissolution, this was not a lifeline. This was a resurrection. Now think about that. The company that had built military trucks for Japan during the Second World War was now building trucks for the American military in Korea. History has a strange way of threading its needle, and what Toyota did with that capital was not to stabilize and rest, it was to invest in manufacturing equipment, in production techniques, in the methodology that Kiichiro's cousin Eiji Toyoda and the industrial engineer Taiichi Ohno were assembling into something that would transform not just Toyota, but the entire global concept of manufacturing. Eiji Toyoda had visited Ford's River Rouge plant in Michigan in 1950, the same year the Korean War began. He came back with notebooks full of observations and a conviction that the American mass production model, while impressive in scale, was fundamentally inefficient in its use of materials, time, and human attention. Ford produced in huge batches. It stocked enormous inventories. It treated the factory floor as a machine to be operated at maximum speed, regardless of downstream demand. Eiji and Ohno believed there was a better way, a system built on producing exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, with zero waste. What they built over the next decade became known as the Toyota Production System. Just-in-time manufacturing, Kanban inventory control, the principle that any worker on the line could and should stop production the moment they identified a defect, exactly as Sakichi's Type G loom had stopped itself when it detected a broken thread. The philosophy of the loom had become the philosophy of the factory. Sakichi's Jidoka had crossed 50 years and an entire industrial revolution to arrive in a car plant in Aichi Prefecture, and it still worked. By 1955, Toyota had introduced the Crown, Japan's first purpose-built premium passenger car. By 1957, they entered the American market for the first time. The initial reception was, to put it charitably, modest. The early Crowns were underpowered for American highways and not built for the distances Americans drove. Toyota withdrew, studied the feedback, rebuilt, and returned. That pattern, listen, absorb, improve, return, was by now genetic. It was not a strategy they adopted. It was what they were. In 1965, the Corolla launched. A compact, affordable, exceptionally reliable sedan aimed at ordinary families in Japan and, eventually, everywhere else. The Corolla was not dramatic. It did not promise speed or status. It promised something more radical in the automobile market. It promised to work. Every time. For a long time. Without asking too much from the person who owned it. Became the best-selling car model in history. a title it still holds today, with over 50 million units sold across its generations. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo sent fuel prices across the Western world into a spiral that Detroit had not prepared for. The big three American automakers had built their identity on large, powerful, fuel-hungry vehicles. Toyota had built its identity on precision, efficiency, and doing more with less. When American consumers began looking for something smaller, more economical, and this was the new word, reliable, they found Japanese cars waiting for them with a patience that looked like foresight. By the 1980s, Toyota was not just competing in the global market, it was redefining what global automotive competition looked like. American and European manufacturers were sending engineers to Aichi Prefecture to study the Toyota production system, the way Eiji Toyoda had once gone to Michigan to study Ford. The direction of the industrial pilgrimage had reversed. The student had become the teacher. In 1989, Toyota launched Lexus, a luxury brand built from the ground up to compete with Mercedes-Benz and BMW on quality, not just price. The development of the flagship LS400 involved 45 designers, 24 engineering teams, 2,200 technicians, and a prototype tested and refined for over 3 years before production began. When the LS400 launched at roughly half the price of a comparable German competitor, with quality ratings that exceeded anything previously measured in the segment, the automotive world had to revise its assumptions about what Japanese manufacturing was capable of. This was not a company that had found its ceiling. It was a company that kept building another floor. In 2008, Toyota became, briefly, then permanently, the world's largest automaker by sales volume, surpassing General Motors for the first time. The company, founded in a textile loom department, nearly bankrupted in 1949, saved by Korean War truck contracts, rebuilt on a philosophy that could be traced directly to a wooden shed in Shizuoka Prefecture in 1890, that company was now making more cars than any other entity on the planet. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we close this story, because this is the part that doesn't show up in the production figures or the sales charts. What made Toyota extraordinary was never, at its core, a manufacturing system. The Toyota production system is real, and it is remarkable, and it has been studied and imitated by industries far beyond automobiles. But the system was not the origin. The origin was a man in a shed who could not stop trying to make a broken thing work better. The origin was a dying father who handed his son a dream and asked him to carry it forward. The origin was a son who resigned from everything he had built because he believed his workers deserved a leader who took responsibility. The origin was a company that treated every crisis, debt, war, occupation, competition, not as a reason to stop, but as information about what needed to be improved. Kiichiro Toyoda built a loom that could stop itself when something was wrong. His son built a car company on the same idea. His successors built a global empire on it. And the thread, that original thread, has never actually broken. It has just been rewoven, generation by generation, into something larger than any one of them could have imagined from inside that shed. He built looms. His son built cars. His successors built the future. And they did it by refusing, in every moment of crisis, to cut the thread. Drop a comment. Do you think Toyota's story is the greatest industrial comeback of the 20th century? Or is there another company that rivals it?